This lecture is on Chapter 9, Circulatory Response to Exercise. The circulatory system works together with the pulmonary or respiratory system, and so they're often talked about together as the cardiopulmonary or cardiorespiratory system. The purpose of the cardiorespiratory system is to transport oxygen and nutrients to your tissues. It's also there to remove CO2 waste. For example, when you're doing aerobic respiration, you generate CO2, and we also generate nitrogenous waste, and that has to be taken away from our tissues. And in addition, the cardiorespiratory system is very important for body temperature regulation. So for example, the core of your body is at 37 degrees centigrade. If you're in a hot environment, then your body may overheat. And so to get rid of heat, you'll have increased blood flow to the skin. The skin may have a sort of a flushed appearance, or this may obviously occur also when you're exercising, when you have excess heat due to buildup of heat due to muscular contraction. Conversely, when you are in a cold environment, you'll conserve heat, that core body temperature, and the way you do that is to have less blood flow to the skin. And basically what you're doing is you're reducing the difference in temperature between the skin or the body surface and the environment. And that reduces the conduction of heat away from the body, thereby conserving heat. And the cardiovascular system is also important for the transport of hormones, which we've talked about before. Now, during exercise, things change pretty dramatically. You can have a tremendous increase in cardiac output. So for example, the demand for oxygen may increase by a tremendous factor, maybe 15 to 25 times. Furthermore, there may be a redistribution of blood flow from inactive organs to active muscle. So if you're exercising, there's going to be an increase in blood flow to skeletal muscle in your arms and legs. There'll be a decrease in blood flow to your kidneys, to the GI tract. There's actually an increase. What's surprising to many people is there's actually an increase in blood flow to the liver while you're exercising, but that's actually makes perfect sense when you think about the liver having glycogen. And so glycogen can be broken down into glucose and released into the blood. So actually there's often an increase in blood flow to the liver. And when you're exercising, there's often also an increase in blood flow to the brain, which is of course good for the brain. So that's another reason why exercise is so helpful in terms of health. It brings a little bit extra blood flow to the brain. In order to perfuse the organs of your body, you need pressure. Pressure is the force, which you can think of as a kind of potential energy. It's the force, it's the potential energy that can be translated into kinetic energy or energy of movement of the blood. And so this pressure will push the blood through the various organs of your body, and that's called perfusion. So the heart creates the pressure that does this perfusion. And moving from the heart, you then go into if we're talking about the systemic circulatory system, where the blood then moves to the aorta, which is the largest artery, then to other major arteries. And finally, you get to very small arteries called arterioles. These have smooth muscle associated with them, and they're able to change their diameter. And so you have the phenomenon of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And that's actually the main way that you're able to regulate blood flow to different organs is through vasodilation and vasoconstriction at the level of the arterioles. The other arteries do have smooth muscle associated with them. And there are arteries that are quite large before you get to the arterioles, and those are referred to as muscular arteries, and they do in fact also change in diameter, and that's also helpful in terms of the distribution of blood to the various organs. The capillaries are very small. They don't have smooth muscle associated with them, and they essentially just have a single layer of endothelium, which are these epithelial cells, and they're relatively thin, and this allows for good exchange of oxygen and CO2 and nutrients with the tissues. And so many of the capillaries in your body are considered to be fairly leaky, so they allow for the movement of water and solutes. And so this is how we actually generate interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that bathes the cells of your body. There's always a constant slight net loss of fluid from the capillaries of your body and into the interstitial space. And you'll actually note this, like say you're on a really long plane flight, you may notice that your feet will actually swell up if you haven't been moving very much. And we can talk more about interstitial fluid later. Now, at the next point after the capillaries are the venules. These are small, very small veins. They have smooth muscle associated with them. And the blood flows from the venules into larger veins, and then in even larger veins, and finally back to the heart. Now, these veins do, in fact, have smooth muscle associated with them, and they are innervated by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And that can be important in terms of situations in which you lose blood. These veins and venules can vasoconstrict, and that can help make up for blood loss. And so the other thing I should point out is that terminology, artery and arterioles, always carry blood away from the heart. So it's the direction of the blood flow that's important, not the oxygenation status of the blood. And veins and venules always carry blood towards the heart. Before we go into the details of the actual cardiac anatomy, we should just think about what the heart does. It's a four-chambered heart, but it actually consists of two pumps. You have the right side, which is shown here in this diagram, and the left side. And they really are, they're going to contract together, but they're actually functionally two independent pumps. And so this is actually quite an ingenious way of designing the cardiovascular system, because it turns out the pressure in the pulmonary circulation, the pulmonary circulation is the circulation that starts on the right side of the heart at the level of the right ventricle, which you can't see here, but we'll see in a more detailed diagram in a second. Blood is pumped out through the pulmonary trunk and into the pulmonary arteries, then into the pulmonary, to the lungs, where they go through the pulmonary capillaries, and then the blood comes back through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, or the left side of the heart. So that's called the pulmonary circuit. And that circuit has less resistance to flow, and therefore it doesn't need as high a pressure. So if you look at the heart, you'll see that the wall of the left atrium is actually much thicker than the wall of the right atrium. And that's the reason, is because this pulmonary circuit doesn't require as much pressure, so the right heart side of the heart doesn't have to work as hard. Now, if we look at the other circuit, this is referred to as systemic circulation. So from the left ventricle, blood exits through the aorta. We'll see more details of that in a second. And then goes into other major arteries, which have fairly elastic walls. Then they go into arteries that are called distributing arteries or muscular arteries. And from there, they go into arterioles, and finally into various capillary beds. So you have the capillaries, and then you have the venules, and then the veins, and so forth. And then we're right back at the right atrium. So this is called the systemic circulation, or sometimes also referred to as a systemic circuit. Now that, if you can imagine it, there's many, many capillary beds, and the distances are greater and so forth. So there's more resistance to blood flow in that circuit. And therefore, there has to be a higher pressure generated by the left side of the heart. So if you look at the left side of the heart, the walls are much thicker and more muscular than the right side of the heart, if you look at the ventricles. So they're a little bit different, the two sides of the heart. Let's look in a little more detail at the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit, as I said, starts from the right side of the heart. It's going to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Remember, deoxygenated blood comes back to the right side of the heart from the systemic circuit. Now, this blood picks up oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries, and it releases CO2. And then the blood returns through pulmonary veins to the left atrium. Okay, and that blood will be oxygenated. So notice here that the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood. So again, what's important here is the directionality. So if blood is moving away from the heart, the blood vessel is considered to be an artery. If blood is moving back towards the heart, the blood vessel is considered to be a vein. Now, if you look at the systemic circuit, blood leaves from the left side of the heart. It's pumped out, it's ejected from the left ventricle into the aorta, and then into other major arteries, which are fairly elastic, then into the muscular distributing arteries, and then into arterioles and into capillary beds. And here you can see that oxygen goes into the tissues of, say, skeletal muscle, and the blood plasma also picks up CO2 due to aerobic metabolism at the cellular level, say in skeletal muscle or some other organ. And then the blood comes back. So this is the deoxygenated blood then coming back to the right atrium. We'll next look in some more detail at the actual anatomy of the heart. As you can see, deoxygenated blood comes to the right atrium through the superior vena cava. So that's going to bring blood back from the upper part of the body. The blood coming back from the lower part of the body would be coming through the inferior vena cava. Now the blood then goes to the right atrioventricular valve, also called the tricuspid valve, because it has 3 cusps, or sometimes these are referred to as leaflets. It then goes into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, the blood then leaves, going through the pulmonary semilunar valve. It's referred to as a semilunar valve because the cusps look sort of like half moons. The blood enters into the pulmonary trunk and then goes into the pulmonary artery. So now it's going to go off to the lungs. It's going to pick up oxygen, and then the blood comes back through the pulmonary veins, which you can see here. There's left pulmonary veins and there's the right pulmonary veins. So it's a little hard to see, but this blood all comes back into the left atrium. So now it's oxygenated. The blood passes through the left atrioventricular valve, which is referred to as the bicuspid because it has 2 cusps. It's also referred to as the mitral valve because if you sort of flip it over upside down, it has these 2 cusps, and it looks a lot like the formal headgear of a bishop, say in the Roman Catholic Church. So that hat is called a mitre, and so therefore it's called the mitral valve. The blood enters into the left ventricle through this valve, and then it goes through the aortic valve into the aorta, which is the major artery that leaves the heart. And then from there, it goes into other very large diameter arteries, which have fairly elastic walls, as I mentioned, for the aorta. These would also be very elastic, the first major arteries. The take-home message of what we talked about so far is that the purpose of the cardiovascular system is the following: the transport of oxygen to tissue and the removal of waste. When we're talking about waste, we're often referring to nitrogenous waste. So the cells of your body produce ammonia. Ammonia is very toxic, and it will be converted into urea and then released from the body. The transport of nutrients to the tissue. So specifically, we've talked a lot about this, but this could be glucose. It could be free fatty acids, which can be used as fuel by skeletal muscle, also by cardiac muscle. It can also involve amino acids. So there are many different types of nutrients. And finally, regulation of body temperature. The heart is essentially, it's a 4-chambered heart, but it's essentially 2 pumps in one. The right side of the heart pumps the blood through the pulmonary circulation, whereas the left side of the heart delivers blood to the systemic circulation. And as I mentioned, because of the difference in resistance to flow, the right side of the heart, the right ventricle, is much less muscular than the left side of the heart, particularly the left ventricle. Left ventricle has to essentially push blood to the whole body, most of the body except for the lungs. And so it has to be much more muscular, and it generates a much higher pressure than the right ventricle. Next, let's consider the heart wall. The outer layer is called the epicardium. This layer serves to protect the heart, and it's essentially kind of like a sac. It has 2 layers, so it surrounds the heart, and between those 2 layers, there's fluid, and so it acts to lubricate the heart. So the heart, which is, of course, moving all the time, doesn't rub up against any other organs. And so this protects the heart. The next layer in is the middle layer, and that's the myocardium. And that's mostly made up of muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells. It also contains connective tissue, blood capillaries, lymph capillaries, and nerve fibers. And so the myocardium, of course, is responsible for contracting, increasing pressure within the chambers of the heart, and propelling the blood. The next layer in is called the endocardium. And the innermost part of the endocardium is a layer of single cells called the endothelium, which are epithelial cells that protect the heart. And just in between that layer, the endothelium and the myocardium, part of the endocardium is an acellular matrix that contains collagenous fibers as well as elastic fibers. And so the overall purpose of the endocardium is to protect the heart from the movement of fluid within the heart. So the heart is an extremely metabolically active organ. It needs a large supply of blood all the time, and it gets blood through the coronary arteries. There are 4 coronary arteries, 2 are relatively major, and then the blood is taken away via coronary veins. Occasionally, what will happen is that a coronary artery may become blocked. And if that happens, then that can lead to ischemia, cardiac ischemia, which means that there's a portion of the heart that is starved of oxygen. So the cells don't have enough oxygen. Again, the heart is very metabolically active. Therefore, these cells may die if the ischemia goes on long enough. And when you have a portion of the heart that dies, that's referred to as a myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack. And there are various causes, but one common cause is you may have a blood clot that travels through the coronary arteries. They may hit a region that's perhaps narrower than it should be, and it may get blocked, and then that can lead to damage to the heart. So there are different levels of heart attacks, myocardial infarctions. You can have a mild one, which means that just a small portion of this myocardium is damaged, and some cells die and are turned into scar tissue, or it could be a much more major event, in which a larger portion of the myocardium is damaged, the cells die, and are turned irreversibly into scar tissue. Heart muscle is quite different from skeletal muscle. Recall that skeletal muscle consists of very long cells that are a syncytium, in which you have multiple cells that essentially fuse together. So they're multinucleate, very long cells. Cardiac cells are shorter and branched, as you can see here. They often have almost kind of a Y shape to them. They also only have 1 nucleus per cell. Cardiac muscle cells have contractions that are involuntary. So you can't voluntarily control your heart rate. You can, of course, think of something scary that would activate the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and that would lead to the release of neurotransmitter and hormones that would lead to an increase in your heart rate. But you can't actually directly control the heart rate the way you can skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle cells are interconnected via intercalated discs. So skeletal muscles don't have these discs. So for example, here you can see an intercalated disc between 2 cardiac cells. In a blow-up of that, you can see at the intercalated disc, there are different types of proteins. Now, some of these proteins will serve to essentially rivet the 2 cells together. That's called a desmosome. And the other type of proteins we have here are called gap junctions. The actual protein is called a connexin, but when they form this pore, that's an aqueous pore that allows for the movement of sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, even small molecules such as ATP and glucose can move through these junctions. They're referred to as a gap junction. Now that's synonymous with electrical synapse. So these are thought to be they are electrical synapses because they allow these charged ions to pass through them. So these function to allow for an action potential in one cardiac muscle cell to travel into an adjoining cardiac muscle cell. And so this is how you have a wave of depolarization or an action potential propagate from one cell to the next. It's through these electrical synapses, referred to as gap junctions. Additionally, the cardiac muscle cells of the atria are electrically isolated from the cardiac muscle cells of the ventricles. The heart has this fibrous skeleton, which you can't see here. I'm not showing a picture of that, but this fibrous skeleton prevents the movement of these electrical signals between the atria and the ventricles. Therefore, the atria will contract together because the two sides are electrically connected, and the ventricles will contract together because they're electrically connected. But the only communication between the atria and the ventricle is through a node called the atrioventricular node, which we'll talk about later. Cardiac muscle cells are highly aerobic. They contain many mitochondria. So they're more similar to, say, type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers in that sense. In this table from your textbook, we can see a further comparison of heart muscle and skeletal muscle. In both types of muscles, we have the same contractile proteins, actin and myosin. Again, heart muscle has a different shape. It's shorter than skeletal muscles, and it's often branching. Skeletal muscle is elongated with no branching. Heart muscle cells have a single nucleus. Skeletal muscles are multinucleate. They both have Z discs. They're both striated, meaning that they have arrangements of actin and myosin that form sarcomeres that are clearly visible at the light microscope level. Cellular junctions, there are none for skeletal muscles. There are no junctional complexes, whereas with heart muscle, again, there are these intercalated discs that have special proteins that mechanically tie together the muscle cells, and then there are other special proteins that form gap junctions, which are electrical synapses between the muscle cells. In terms of connective tissue, the heart muscle has endomysium, whereas the skeletal muscle has epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. Heart muscle cells are primarily aerobic. They do have some capacity to do anaerobic metabolism, but it's relatively small. Skeletal muscle are both aerobic and anaerobic. Skeletal muscle, for the contractions to occur, the source of calcium for skeletal muscle is nearly, well, it's 100% the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Recall that as an action potential, which is a wave of excitation, passes along the membrane of a skeletal muscle, it triggers certain proteins, which then are connected to channels within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so that leads to calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, leading to contraction. In heart muscle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is triggered in a different way, although similar. So there are voltage-gated calcium channels in the plasma membrane of a heart muscle. So as an action potential passes over these calcium channels, they open in response to the depolarization. Calcium moves into the cell from outside of the cell, from the extracellular space, and then the calcium itself binds to and activates calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is referred to as calcium-induced calcium release. The calcium that's released into the cytosol then leads to contraction. Heart muscle is controlled involuntarily, where skeletal muscle is voluntary. In terms of regeneration, skeletal muscle does have the possibility of regeneration via satellite cells, which are these adult stem cells that can specifically regenerate more skeletal muscle if need be. In the heart, there appear to be no satellite cells present. Because of the lack of stem cells, adult stem cells called satellites cells in hearts, there have been a number of attempts to repair the heart in other ways. So for example, here, what you see is a patch of lab-grown human heart tissue. It's been grown, these cells have been grown in a scaffold, which you can see here. This is a very specific shape here. The idea of the holes is that that'll make it easier to attach this patch essentially to a damaged heart. On the right, you can see they've actually done this in mice. And so what they've done is they've added a patch like this, and you can see the new heart muscle cells in green, and then in red, you can see capillaries. And so these stem cells are not stem cells that come from the heart. They're stem cells that have come from some other part of the body and that have been reprogrammed to form cardiomyocytes or heart muscle cells. There's now lots of evidence that regular exercise is cardioprotective. People that are active, that participate in exercise a certain number of times per week, have a reduced incidence of heart attack. If they do have a heart attack, their survival rates are greater than in inactive people. Exercise reduces the amount of myocardial damage from a heart attack. That's shown here in this graph. So here's an untrained person. So the percentage of cardiac injury during a myocardial infection, so you can see a large percentage. For a trained person, this percentage is lower, indicating that they're not suffering from as great or important of a heart attack. And why does this happen? Well, there's some evidence that there's an improvement in the heart's antioxidant capacity. So antioxidants protect against free radicals. And one time in your body when you have free radicals is after ischemia, when there's reperfusion of the tissue with oxygen. That's when there's the generation of a sort of a burst of these free radicals. Now, free radicals are atoms that have an unpaired electron. And electrons don't like to be unpaired, so they want to pair up with an electron from, say, another atom within another molecule. And as they do that, they will damage other molecules. So they can damage protein, they can damage DNA, they can damage lipids, and so forth. And so they create a tremendous amount of damage to the molecular machinery within a cell. And our natural defense against that is antioxidants. So you have antioxidants that protect against that. So this is essentially a proposed mechanism for how the heart is protected through exercise. Finally, there's also an improvement in function of a certain type of channel called an ATP-sensitive potassium channel. The next topic is the cardiac cycle. In order to understand the cardiac cycle, we need to understand how the valves in the heart work. The valves open and close in response to pressure differences. So when the pressure in the right atrium is greater than that of the pressure in the right ventricle, then the right atrioventricular valve, also called the tricuspid, is open. Conversely, when the pressure is higher in the right ventricle than in the right atrium, then this right atrioventricular valve will close. And you can see when it closes, there's actually some structures here that help this. These valves will shut, and there's a chance that these valves may evert into the right atrium. To prevent that, you have chordae tendineae, which are these heart cords, these fibrous cords. In addition, you also have papillary muscles that will contract and prevent this eversion from happening. If we move on to the next valve, we can see here, this is the pulmonary valve. It's within the pulmonary trunk, which leaves the right ventricle. When the pressure is higher in the right ventricle than in the in the pulmonary trunk, then this semilunar valve called the pulmonary valve is open. Conversely, if the pressure is higher in the pulmonary trunk compared to the right ventricle, then the cusps, which are semilunar in shape, which means they look a little bit like half moons, they fill up with blood, and that forces this valve to shut. If we look at the left side of the heart, there's a similar situation. When the left ventricular atrial pressure is higher than the left ventricular pressure, then blood will flow in from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Conversely, if the pressure is higher in the left ventricle compared to the left atrium, then these valves shut, and again, they're prevented from everting due to these chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. If the pressure is higher in the left ventricle compared to the aortic valve, which is the left semilunar valve, then this valve will be open. However, if the aortic pressure is higher than the left ventricular pressure, then the aortic valve will shut. And again, it has these cusps that are shaped in a sort of half moon fashion shape. So they will fill up with blood, and that will end up shutting this valve. The cardiac cycle is a repeating pattern of contraction and relaxation of the heart. Systole refers to contraction of heart muscles, whereas diastole refers to the relaxation of heart muscles. If I use the term systole by itself, I'm referring to ventricular systole. And if I use the term diastole by itself, I'm referring to ventricular diastole. The atria, of course, contract and relax also. So there's also atrial systole and atrial diastole. In this diagram here, we can see a typical heartbeat or cardiac cycle. You can see here the ventricular diastole lasts for about a half a second, 0.5 seconds, whereas systole lasts for about 0.3 seconds. So this would be in a resting adult, these sort of typical values. So first thing to notice is that the ventricular diastole at rest is longer than the ventricular systole. So there's more time where the heart is relaxed relative to the heart actually contracting. Okay, let's start this and try and analyze this, starting at the point where the ventricles are in diastole, so they're relaxed. At this point, if we look at the atria here, they're already in a relaxed state. Now, during this period where they're both relaxed, blood will be flowing back into the atria, and then from the atria into the ventricles. Eventually, the ventricles will become quite filled with blood, and you can see that as an increase in the sort of red color here in this diagram. And then eventually what happens is the atria will go into systole. So atrial systole occurs near the end of ventricular diastole. And what's the purpose of this? Well, the atria are going to contract, and they're going to push. Up till now, we've had sort of a passive flow of blood back into the atria, and then from there into the ventricles. That's due to the blood pressure of the heart, blood returning to the heart. But now there's going to be an active contraction, and the atria will push an additional amount of blood from the atria into the ventricles. So when in a person that's at rest, the ventricles will have filled about 80%, and then the final 20% or so will be due to this atrial contraction. And this is often referred to as the atrial kick. So the atria kick additional blood into the ventricles, and they end up increasing the final volume of blood in the ventricles before the ventricles go into systole, or the contraction phase. The next thing that happens, the ventricles will contract. You can see how the indicated here that in this diagram, the ventricles are filled with blood, indicated by the dark red here. As the ventricles contract, blood will be ejected, and the volume of the ventricles will go down. And that's being shown here with this change in red. So the ventricles are less full. Notice that during this time, during ventricular systole, the atria are now in diastole. They've relaxed. And they continue to be relaxed all the way around during ventricular diastole until the very end of ventricular diastole, where you have them, they contract, and they again will push more blood into the ventricles. As we look at this cycle, there's a few bits of terminology we should get under our belts. One is EDV, or end diastolic volume. Recall that the ventricles are relaxed and they're filling. Then there's the atrial kick. This is atrial systole. And you have a final volume in the ventricles before they go into systole, and that's the end diastolic volume, or EDV. And this is a very important parameter, because the more blood you fill the ventricles with, the more that can be ejected during systole. Now, eventually, blood will be ejected during systole, and therefore the volume of the ventricles will go down. And you finally reach, at the end of systole, the volume will be about a third of the end diastolic volume. In other words, about 2/3 of the blood in the ventricles at EDV, at the end of diastole, the 2/3 of the end diastolic volume are ejected, and you end up with a third of that value at the end of systole. So far, we've considered the cardiac cycle during rest. During rest, recall that during ventricular diastole, that took about 0.5 seconds, and ventricular systole took about 0.3 seconds. This is for a resting heart rate of about 75 beats per minute. Now, things change a bit during heavy exercise. The heart rate may increase to, say, 180 beats per minute. Notice that the time for systole is now decreased to about 0.2 seconds, so it has decreased. But diastole decreases much more. So the duration of diastole goes from 0.5 seconds to 0.13 seconds. So there's a tremendous reduction in diastole. Now, this is actually significant because remember, during rest, most of the blood that filled the ventricles was just occurring due to passive flow through the atrium into the ventricles as the blood was returning through the pulmonary circuit and through the systemic circuit to the heart. During exercise, of course, that also occurs, but the amount of blood that's due to the atrial kick increases quite substantially. So in terms of proportional blood, now the atrial kick becomes more important. We're next going to look at the pressure changes that occur during the cardiac cycle. So we'll start at a convenient starting point, which is diastole, ventricular diastole. So initially the pressure is relatively low, particularly as the ventricle continues to relax and increase in volume, the pressure becomes quite low. And during that time, the pressure is lower in the left ventricle compared to the left atrium. Therefore, blood that's flowing back through the pulmonary circuit will flow into the left atrium and from there into the left ventricle. And so as you'd expect, the volume will increase in the left ventricle, which is being shown here. Now, towards the end of ventricular diastole, you have the atrial kick, which we talked about a second ago. So that's atrial systole. So this causes more blood to flow into the left ventricle. And usually, again, that's around 20% or so of the total EDV or end diastolic volume. And you notice this increase in pressure here due to the atria contracting. Now, as we go around in the cycle, we go to the next phase. Here's the atrial kick again. Now we go into ventricular systole. So the left ventricle contracts. There's an increase in pressure due to the contraction. And unfortunately, it's not shown, but the atrial pressure is not shown, but it will be lower at some point than the left ventricular pressure. So the left atrial pressure will be lower than the left ventricular pressure. So recall that the left atrial ventricular valve will then shut because there will be pressure against the cusps or of the valves. They'll be held in place by the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles that prevent them from everting. And so now the left atrioventricular valve is closed. Of course, it's the same thing is happening on the right side, but just to simplify things, I'm talking about the left side of the heart. And that is, in fact, the cause of the first heart sound. So when those valves shut, the shutting the valves themselves doesn't actually cause the sound, but there's sort of a reverberation. That's because the fluid that was flowing now suddenly stops, and it causes the heart structures to reverberate a bit. And so that's the first sound, which is often called lub. Okay, the next thing that happens is now the atrioventricular valve is shut on the left side, and that happens quite early here on and during systole. Now the pressure continues to increase very dramatically in the left ventricle, and then eventually the pressure in the left ventricle will be greater than that of the aortic pressure. And therefore, the left semilunar valve, also known as the aortic valve, will open, and then blood will be ejected. And it's not really shown here, but this would be the ejection phase. So the left ventricle will continue to contract, and the pressure will go up and up and up. Now, even as it continues to contract towards the end, you can imagine it's sort of contracted about as much as it can. So even though it's contracting, the pressure will eventually go down, because remember, the blood is being ejected, and so there's less blood pushing back against the walls of the ventricle, so the left ventricular pressure will drop. And eventually you get to the point where the left ventricular pressure actually drops below that of the aortic pressure. And a lot of students find that confusing. Well, why is the aortic pressure higher than the left ventricular pressure? Well, the aorta and the other major arteries are elastic, meaning that they have a lot of elastic proteins in them, such as elastin, and so they can increase in diameter. And remember, I told you pressure can be thought of as kind of potential energy. So this puts energy into the walls of the aorta and the other elastic arteries. And once that aortic valve closes, then there will be an elastic recoil. So the aorta and the other major arteries will start to decrease in diameter. And what they're doing is they're squeezing the blood, and that keeps the pressure high within the aorta. Okay, so now at this point, the aortic pressure is higher than the left ventricular pressure. At that point, Remember, the aortic valve consists of these semilunar cusps that look sort of like half moons. So they're cup shaped, so they fill up with blood and they close, and the aortic valve closes. So now the aortic valve closes. And on the other side, it's the semilunar valve on the right side, which is the pulmonary valve. That closes more or less at the same time, and that causes the second heart sound, which is dub, or sometimes it's referred to as dup. So that's the second heart sound. And now the left ventricle continues to relax, and the pressure drops pretty dramatically. And finally, at some point, it drops below that of the left atrium, and the left atrial ventricular valve opens. Now that's silent. The opening of the valves is silent. When the aortic valve opened over here, that's a silent event. And here, the opening of the atrioventricular valves is silent. But now you can see what the result of that. If the left atrioventricular valve is open, then blood flows into the left ventricle, and the left ventricular volume increases, as you can see here, all the way to the point where we get to the atrial systole, and you can see the volume increasing due to the atrial kick. The arterial blood pressure is expressed as systolic blood pressure, the pressure generated during ventricular contraction, divided by diastolic pressure, which is the pressure during cardiac relaxation. So the normal value for a male would be about 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. For a female, it's 110 over 70. Another valuable measurement that can be made is the pulse pressure. That's the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure. So you simply take the systolic pressure and subtract the diastolic pressure. One of the most important parameters you can measure is the mean arterial pressure, or MAP. This is the average pressure in the arteries. When a person is relaxed, they spend about 2/3 of their time in diastole, in the cardiac cycle, and about 1/3 in systole. Therefore, we can use this formula. We take the diastolic blood pressure and simply add 1/3, or 0.33, multiplied by the pulse pressure, which is the systolic blood pressure, and you take the systolic blood pressure and subtract the diastolic blood pressure. Now, this doesn't work if the person is exercising, because as I just explained previously, the time spent during diastole becomes shorter relative to the full cardiac cycle. So it's no longer 2/3 of the cardiac cycle. In fact, when a person is exercising very vigorously, systole may actually occupy 2/3, or about 66% of the total cardiac cycle. So you would need to be able to determine what percentage of the time the person was in diastole or systole, or another way is to simply measure using, say, a computer system, where you'd measure data points throughout the full cardiac cycle, and then simply take the average, the time average over all of those data points. Quite a shocking statistic is about 33% of adults, that is people over 20 years of age in the US, have hypertension. Hypertension refers to high blood pressure, and the typical value to identify hypertension is blood pressure above 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury. So this is due to things like diet and exercise, and as people age, it's actually almost inevitable. Almost everyone eventually is subject to some form of hypertension. And there are different types of hypertension. One is primary or essential hypertension. This is hypertension that has a multifactorial cause. That means there's several different factors that lead to the hypertension, and this makes up about 95% of the cases of hypertension. This is basically the kind of normal hypertension that adults get, and it's due to, all the various factors, such as hardening of the arteries, perhaps changes in heart function and so forth that occur as people age. Now, another type of hypertension is secondary hypertension. This is when the disease is secondary to another identifiable disease process. So, for example, someone with obstructive sleep apnea may develop hypertension, but it's secondary to their obstructive sleep apnea. Similarly, someone with kidney problems may show signs of hypertension, but as soon as you solve or ameliorate their kidney problems, that hypertension may go away. So the insidious thing about hypertension is it sort of sneaks up on people. It takes years to develop, and you may be asymptomatic. You may not show any signs of it whatsoever. The good thing about it, if there is a good thing, is that it's fairly easy to diagnose. If you go to the doctor's office and they measure your blood pressure and it's too high, they will start to suggest that you exercise and change your diet and perhaps take some drugs. Now, if you let hypertension go on too long and you don't address these issues, it can lead to a lot of very horrible outcomes. One common one is left ventricular hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is when an organ grows bigger than it should be. So what happens with hypertension is you essentially have a lot of high systemic pressure, and that, in order to pump the blood out of the left ventricle, in order to get it to go through the systemic circulatory system, the left side of the heart has to work really hard. So initially, there's an adaptive response, which is the walls of the left ventricle become thicker as the muscle gets stronger. But unfortunately, if it gets too thick and this goes on too long, this actually leads to the left ventricle actually weakening, so it becomes not effective at pumping blood out. And then you get into all sorts of problems that could lead to heart failure, for one thing, as the heart starts to get weaker. Also, if the left ventricle is not keeping up with the right ventricle, what can happen is this can lead to an increase in the blood pressure within the pulmonary circulation of the pulmonary circuit. And you can then have edema, pulmonary edema, in which the blood pressure is high enough in that pulmonary circuit. And recall that normally the pressure, the resistance to that circuit is lower than the systemic circuit, and the pressure, therefore, is also correspondingly much lower in the pulmonary circuit. So if you start to have an increase in blood pressure in the pulmonary circuit, then that can lead to the blood pressure actually acting on the capillaries, the pulmonary capillaries, and it would push fluid out into the interstitial space. And so this is called edema. You have swelling in the lungs. And this can actually lead to problems with breathing. So it's all actually very serious, and so it should be treated carefully with drugs and so forth. Hypertension is also a risk factor for atherosclerosis, which is a hardening of the arteries due to the buildup of plaque within the circulatory system. It's a little confusing, but there's also another term called arteriosclerosis. So that's a general term for hardening of the arteries, which may have other causes other than buildup of plaque within the circulatory system. The most common factor that leads to arteriosclerosis or hardening of the arteries is atherosclerosis. Again, apologies for the terms being so similar. And atherosclerosis is the buildup of plaque, these fatty plaques within the arteries. Hypertension can also, as I said, overtax the heart, and this could lead to a heart attack. And atherosclerosis also can occur within the coronary arteries, and that can also lead to a heart attack. Hypertension can also lead to kidney damage. So the kidney is very sensitive to changes in blood pressure. The filtration within the kidney is dependent on blood pressure, and so it's not surprising that if the pressure is too high, then this could damage the kidney. And finally, you have very delicate blood vessels within the brain, and so if those can be damaged by high blood pressure, you can have essentially one of those delicate blood vessels can break if the blood pressure is too high, and this can lead to a stroke in which you've actually damaged part of the brain and lost brain cells. As I said, it's very important that we measure our blood pressure, and so we did do this in lab, but I'm going to go over this again because it's done quite nicely in this figure from the book. So to measure blood pressure, we want to determine the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. So we put a cuff on the arm, and the arm is kept in a neutral position, so it's at about the same level as the heart, roughly. And so what you're really trying to get at is the aortic blood pressure. And so when you go from the aorta, which is a major blood vessel, to other very large blood vessels, and even to the brachial blood artery, which is within the arm, those are actually really large blood vessels. So you don't lose a lot of blood pressure due to resistance. The real resistance comes later in the circulatory system when you get to the level of smaller arteries, arterioles, and capillaries. So we're getting a pretty accurate picture of the aortic pressure, particularly also due to the fact that we're keeping the cuff right at about the same level as the heart. Okay, so then we pump up the cuff so that it blocks the blood flow through the brachial artery. As you can see here, the brachial artery collapses, and you should hear nothing at that point. And in fact, before you pump up the cuff, you shouldn't hear anything at that point either, because the blood vessels are open, and you have what's called laminar flow, where the blood is just flowing very smoothly through the artery, and there's no sound. Now, as you gradually drop the pressure in the cuff, and it's usually, if you don't know what the person's blood pressure is, it's argued you should probably start around 180. And then you would drop it lower and lower and lower. And then you would, as the brachial artery opens up a little bit, you get turbulent flow occurring just during systole, because the systolic pressure is high enough that the blood can spurt through. And so you hear these initial sounds, and that you would then mark down as being systolic pressure. And then as you go a bit further, now you hear the turbulent flow during diastole, when the heart is relaxed and yet there's still blood pressure. And now that you have turbulent flow during diastole. So you'll hear those sounds. So the nature of the sound will be slightly different, but you'll hear these sort of sounds. And then eventually, you can see here that the brachial artery is becoming more and more round as the pressure goes down, as you're letting the pressure go down and down. Eventually, it's open completely, and you revert to completely laminar flow both during systole and diastole, and so there's no heart sound at that point. And so at that point, and you'd mark that then as being the diastolic pressure, where the absence of sound occurs. And so with the first sound, that's systolic pressure. When the sound eventually goes away, that is the diastolic pressure. And these sounds are named Korotkoff sounds.